It was the early hours of May 12, 2010. A typical day for the passengers aboard Africa Airways Flight 771. The Airbus A, the 330-202, had already endured a long journey, travelling from Johannesburg, South Africa, to its final destination in Tripoli, Libya. On board were 104 souls, men, women and children, all looking forward to reaching their destination. Many were planning to make connecting flights to Europe, including a family of 4 from the Netherlands. Among them was Ruben van Assoul, a bright and energetic 9-year-old boy travelling with his parents and brother. But as the plane approached Tripoli, the ordinary became unimaginable. Only moments from landing, the aircraft descended rapidly. What started as a routine approach turned into a nightmarish spiral. The sky, once a calm blanket over the Libyan landscape, was now filled with uncertainty. The plane, struggling in its final moments, crashed just a few miles short of the runway. The aftermath was devastating. Bodies were scattered across the sand, the wreckage twisted and broken, barely recognizable as what had once been a massive airliner. It seemed impossible that anyone could have survived such destruction. And yet, there was one, a single miraculous exception to the otherwise overwhelming tragedy. Among the wreckage, rescuers found a lone survivor clinging to life. That survivor was Ruben van Assoul, the 9-year-old boy who would soon become the face of one of aviation's most harrowing tales. How did Ruben survive when 103 others did not? What went so catastrophically wrong that night? And why was this boy the only one spared from the tragedy? These are the questions that haunt the memory of Flight 771, a flight that began like any other, but ended in unimaginable horror. Africa Airways Flight 771 was part of a routine route, one that had been flown numerous times before without incident. The journey began in Johannesburg, the bustling hub of South Africa, and was set to end in Tripoli, the capital of Libya. For many passengers, Tripoli wasn't even the final stop. It was merely a layover before connecting flights to destinations across Europe, including London, Paris and Amsterdam. At the helm of the aircraft was an experienced crew. The captain, Youssef Majdi, had over 16,000 hours of flying experience, and the first officer, Amer Quaz, was also highly skilled. The Airbus A330 itself was a reliable workhorse in the world of aviation, designed to carry large numbers of passengers over long distances. With 93 passengers and 11 crew members aboard, Flight 771 seemed to be a normal transcontinental trip. As the aircraft soared through the night sky, the passengers settled in for the final leg of their journey. The plane was scheduled to land in Tripoli at around 6 a.m., just as the sun would begin to rise over the Libyan desert. The approach to the airport was routine until it wasn't. In the final moments before landing, something went terribly wrong. The plane was about 2,000 feet above the ground, just minutes away from touchdown, when the situation took a drastic turn. Communication between the pilots and the control tower suddenly became muddled. The aircraft began to descend too rapidly, and it veered off course. The pilots attempted to regain control, but it was too late. The plane plunged towards the ground, hitting the desert floor with immense force. In just a few moments, what was once a well-coordinated journey had become one of the deadliest crashes in recent history. The wreckage was spread over a wide area, with pieces of the plane and personal belongings scattered everywhere. The Libyan authorities quickly initiated a rescue operation, but what they found was far from hopeful. Among the debris were the remains of the passengers and crew, all except for one. Ruben van Assoul, somehow, against all odds, had survived the impact. While the rest of the passengers perished, this young boy was found alive, though critically injured. His survival seemed nothing short of a miracle, a spark of hope in an otherwise devastating tragedy. But what caused this fatal descent? What could have led such an advanced aircraft, piloted by an experienced crew, to crash just moments from its destination? As Flight 771 neared its destination, the sense of routine that had defined the journey so far began to slip. It was 5:29 a.m. when the captain contacted Tripoli Air Traffic Control. The controllers gave the crew clearance for a TW locator approach to runway 09, updating them with the latest weather data. It was a clear morning over Tripoli, with low wind and no significant obstacles to landing. The crew acknowledged the instructions and everything seemed to be progressing as planned. Yet, as the aircraft descended towards the airport, a subtle but critical series of errors began to unfold. By 5:58 a.m., the flight crew had initiated their approach and made contact with the control tower. They were instructed to continue their descent and report once they had the runway in sight. Here, one key mistake set the stage for the catastrophe to follow. The crew selected their landing procedure too early, engaging the descent before reaching the TW locator, the point at which the final approach should have started. In the cockpit, there was no immediate sign of concern. Other pilots might not have noticed the error, and the crew themselves seemed unaware of their misstep. As the plane dropped lower and lower, the pilots failed to acquire any visual references to the ground, something that should have triggered immediate caution. At 6 a.m., the aircraft passed over the TW locator, but it was already at 1,000 feet, 200 feet lower than it should have been. The descent continued, and as the plane reached the decision altitude of 720 feet, the captain made a critical call. They would press on. Despite the lack of a visible runway, the captain ordered the crew to continue their descent. It was a fatal decision. Just moments later, at 280 feet, the cockpit's terrain awareness system blared a warning. Too low terrain. The system urged them to pull up, to abort the landing. The captain, realizing the danger, called for a go-around. The autopilot was disengaged, and the first officer attempted to raise the nose of the plane. For 4 brief seconds, it seemed as though disaster might be averted, as the aircraft climbed to 12.3 degrees nose up. But then, confusion took hold in the cockpit. The first officer, perhaps fatigued after a long overnight flight, began to make nose-down inputs, reducing the pitch of the plane. This was a critical error, one that may have been caused by the officer focusing too much on speed rather than altitude. To make matters worse, both pilots were now making simultaneous inputs on the aircraft's controls, adding to the confusion. The captain, trying to assist, didn't realize that his actions were counteracting the first officer's efforts. Warnings continued to sound. Too low terrain, sink rate, and pull up. The aircraft was plummeting towards the ground, and at this point, the situation was spiraling out of control. The captain, in a desperate bid to save the plane, activated the side stick priority button to take control, but it was too late. At just 180 feet above the ground, the aircraft was descending too rapidly to recover. 2 seconds before impact, the captain pulled the side stick fully back, but by then, both pilots were acutely aware that a crash was inevitable. With the plane traveling at 262 knots, over 300 miles per hour, Africa Airways Flight 771 smashed into the ground, just 1,200 meters short of the runway. The wreckage was catastrophic. The aircraft was obliterated by the impact, and a fire quickly engulfed what remained of the fuselage. In those final moments, the fate of 103 souls had been sealed. It seemed impossible that anyone could have survived such a violent crash. Yet, in the midst of this destruction, a miracle was about to unfold. Amid the twisted metal, broken seats, and charred debris of Flight 771, rescuers worked frantically to search for survivors. The scene was a grim one, with little hope of finding anyone alive. Yet, as they combed through the wreckage, they stumbled upon something extraordinary. A small sign of life, buried beneath the remains of what was once an Airbus 330. A 9-year-old boy was found alive. Ruben Vanusu, the sole survivor of the crash, had somehow defied the odds. Critically injured but conscious, he was discovered still strapped to his seat, surrounded by the remains of the plane that had claimed the lives of 103 other people. His parents and older brother had all perished in the crash, but Ruben was miraculously alive. The rescuers, astonished by what they had found, quickly transported Ruben to a nearby hospital in Tripoli. He had suffered multiple fractures, his legs were broken, and his skull had been fractured, but his condition was stable. News of the boy's survival spread quickly, and soon the world was captivated by his incredible story. How had he managed to survive a crash that seemed unsurvivable? Ruben's survival has puzzled experts ever since. Some believe that his position in the aircraft may have played a role. It's possible that the location of his seat shielded him from the worst of the impact, or that the part of the plane he was in didn't suffer the same forces as the rest of the fuselage. Others speculate that sheer luck was a factor, an inexplicable twist of fate that spared him from death when so many others were not as fortunate. But survival in the immediate aftermath was only the beginning of Ruben's journey. His injuries were severe, and doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him. His legs required extensive surgery, and he faced a long road to recovery. Even more difficult than the physical injuries, however, was the emotional toll. At just 9 years old, Ruben had lost his entire family in an instant. He would have to navigate not only the pain of his injuries, but the immense grief that came with such a profound loss. Ruben's story became an international sensation. The media, captivated by the tale of the miracle boy, followed his recovery closely. The Dutch government quickly intervened, arranging for his transport back to the Netherlands, where he could be cared for by relatives. Ruben's aunt and uncle, who became his legal guardians, were by his side as he began the long process of healing. While Ruben's physical wounds eventually healed, the psychological scars were far deeper. Survivor's guilt, the weight of being the sole survivor of such a massive tragedy, would be something Ruben would carry with him for the rest of his life. Psychologists who work with plane crash survivors often talk about the immense burden of such an experience. Questions of why me and why them can haunt survivors for years, if not decades. For Ruben, these questions were even more poignant, given that he had lost not just fellow passengers, but his family. The aftermath of the Africa Airways Flight 771 crash sent shockwaves across the world, with reactions pouring in from all corners. The airline, in an effort to support the grieving families, issued a statement offering to transport and accommodate relatives of the victims in Libya at their own expense. Understanding the immense emotional toll on these families, the Libyan authorities eased passport restrictions and promised swift visa approvals for those wishing to visit the crash site. By May 15, 2010, Africa Airways had established a family assistance centre in a Tripoli hotel, where the executive team, including the CEO and chairperson of the board, personally met with the families. Many relatives travelled to the crash site to pay their respects, laying flowers in remembrance of the loved ones they lost. The airline took a symbolic step by permanently retiring the flight number 771. The route from Tripoli to Johannesburg was redesignated as Flight 788, and its return as Flight 789, marking the end of an era stained by tragedy. On an international scale, the disaster prompted condolences from global leaders. Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands expressed her shock at the tragic loss of life, as the Dutch were hit particularly hard by the crash, with many of the victims being Dutch nationals. South African President Jacob Zuma also extended his condolences, as the flight had originated from Johannesburg, connecting the grief across two continents. The tragedy also found its way into literature. Anne Napolitano's 2020 novel Dear Edward was partially inspired by the events of Flight 771. The book tells the poignant story of a 12-year-old boy who becomes the sole survivor of a plane crash, drawing clear parallels to Ruben Vanassu's miraculous survival at just 9 years old. But what about the crash? What was the cause? Was it an inside job, or was it truly an accident? In the wake of the tragic crash of Africa Airways Flight to 771, a thorough investigation was launched to understand exactly what went wrong during those final critical moments. The Libyan Civil Aviation Authority, LICA, immediately took the lead in the investigation, and soon after, they were joined by a host of international aviation bodies. Airbus, the manufacturer of the doomed A330, offered its full technical support to the inquiry, while the French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, BEA, and the South African Civil Aviation Authority also dispatched teams of investigators. The Dutch Safety Board, with a vested interest due to the many Dutch nationals on board, sent an observer to oversee the process. One of the first steps was to recover the aircraft's flight data recorders, the infamous black boxes, which were soon sent to Paris for detailed analysis. These devices would hold the key to understanding the events that transpired in the cockpit in those final moments. Authorities meticulously combed through the data, hoping to uncover any technical malfunctions, fuel issues, or signs of distress from the crew. However, the results revealed a startling truth. There were no mechanical problems, no fuel shortages, and no emergency calls from the cockpit. From a technical standpoint, the aircraft was functioning perfectly. With no mechanical failures to blame, attention turned to the actions of the flight crew. As investigators pored over the flight data, a clearer picture began to emerge, a picture that pointed squarely to human error. In August 2010, the preliminary investigation results were released. The findings ruled out any external causes, such as terrorism or foul play. Instead, the crash was the result of a series of grave errors committed in the cockpit. On February 28, 2013, the final report was published by the LYCAA. The verdict was conclusive. Pilot error had been the primary cause of the crash. According to the report, the flight crew's coordination and communication had been woefully insufficient during the approach to Tripoli. The lack of a clear action plan between the captain and the first officer caused confusion during a critical phase of the flight, especially when they continued their final approach below the minimum decision altitude without ever having visual confirmation of the runway. Compounding these errors were the inappropriate flight control inputs during the attempted go-around. When the terrain awareness and warning system, TOWAS, activated, urging the crew to pull up and abort the landing, Their responses were erratic and disjointed. The first officer, likely suffering from fatigue after the long overnight flight, made a series of nose-down inputs that only worsened the situation. The captain, attempting to assist, added to the confusion by engaging in dual inputs on the control stick, which caused further instability. Fatigue was highlighted as a potential contributing factor, a common issue on long-haul flights. Sensory illusions may also have played a role, as the crew misinterpreted their altitude and airspeed during those last few seconds. The final report painted a picture of a crew overwhelmed by the situation, lacking the coordinated response necessary to avert disaster. It was a tragic reminder of the importance of clear communication and teamwork in the cockpit. In the end, the investigation brought a measure of clarity, but it also left behind lingering questions. Could more training or stricter regulations around fatigue management have prevented this disaster? How many of these errors could have been avoided with a more cohesive crew dynamic? While the crash of Flight 771 was officially ruled as a case of pilot error, it also underscored the complexities and fragility of human performance in high-stress situations. For Ruben Van Assu, the journey after the crash was just beginning. At the tender age of 9, he had survived a disaster that claimed the lives of his parents, his brother, and 100 other passengers. While his physical injuries were severe, including fractures to his legs and a skull injury, it was the emotional and psychological scars that would take the longest to heal. After being stabilized in a Tripoli hospital, Ruben was flown back to the Netherlands, where he would be cared for by his extended family. His aunt and uncle, who would become his legal guardians, provided him with the comfort and security he desperately needed. But the road to recovery was not an easy one. Ruben had to undergo multiple surgeries to repair his legs and other physical injuries, and the rehabilitation process would take months. During this time, he was shielded from the media as much as possible, as his family sought to protect him from the intense public attention. The Dutch media dubbed him the Miracle Boy. And while his survival was indeed miraculous, the weight of being the only survivor of such a devastating crash was a heavy burden for a child to bear. Ruben had to cope with the overwhelming loss of his entire immediate family, a grief that no child should ever have to endure. Psychologists and grief counselors worked with him to process the trauma, but it was a journey that would take years, and perhaps a lifetime, to fully come to terms with. Despite the tragedy, Ruben's resilience shone through. Over time, he made remarkable physical progress, regaining his mobility and strength, yet the emotional toll was much more complex. Survivor's guilt, a common phenomenon among sole survivors of disasters, likely weighed on him. The question of why me? Why he had been spared when so many others, including his parents and brother, had not, was one that Ruben would have to wrestle with in the years to come. As he grew older, Ruben and his family made a deliberate choice to live out of the public eye. His relatives were fiercely protective of his privacy, ensuring that he could lead as normal a life as possible given the circumstances. Today, Ruben is an adult, and he has largely remained out of the public spotlight. His family has continued to keep his story private, allowing him the space to heal away from the media's gaze. What do you think about Ruben's incredible survival story? What would you like to know more about the investigation or the aftermath? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story as powerful and moving as we have, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into extraordinary events.